The president wants to spy on 200 million Americans without a warrant. Has he read this document, which he was sworn to uphold?
Now, I will not have you libel Abraham Lincoln.
I don't understand the problem with registering guns. We register cars.
Mark Levine brings you the news the government doesn't want you to know.
Today, an explosive story about connections between white supremacists and Islamic terrorists.
When there's a conflict between Scalia's conservative values and the Constitution of the United States, he throws away the Constitution.
When we do have secret prisons, that is not what America's all about.
Let's go to Mark in 5, 4, 3, 2.
Good evening, America. Welcome to The Inside Scoop. Every now and then on The Inside Scoop, we have a viewer who requests a program, and that is what we are doing tonight. A viewer wanted me to invite Yousef Munayyer of the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee on the show to discuss the history and the present of the Israeli-Arab conflict. I'll bring Yousef on in the next quarter hour. I did, though, want to begin with the history. It's amazing to me how few people know the basic history of this region, particularly the older history. Now, where do you start when discussing the history of the Israeli-Arab conflict in the Middle East? Well, where do you begin? You could begin 3,000 years ago with the ancient Jewish kingdoms. In fact, the kingdom of Judea is the kingdom that gave Jews their names. It's interesting. Jews are not named for their religion. Christians are named for Christianity. Muslims are named for Islam. Jews are like Arabs or English or French or Italians. They are named for the land from which they're from. Jews from Judea, Arabs from Arabia, the English from England, French from France, and so forth. Well, there was, of course, the great Jewish kingdom lasted on and off for about 1,000 years, conquered by Persians and Babylonians and others, conquered by the Romans in 70 and 135. And it's the Romans, when they conquered ancient Judea, who changed its name to Palestine, based on the Philistines, a Greek people that had been there 1,000 years earlier. It's no small irony that today there are still Jews fighting people who today call themselves Palestinians, as David fought the Philistines, this Greek people, 3,000 years ago that hasn't existed for 3,000 years. So then the Romans had it, the Arabs conquered it based on the armies of Muhammad. Then, of course, the Christians came in the Crusades. Perhaps the most stable period in the history of Palestine, in the recent history, was the 400 years from 1517 till just before World War I. At that time, the lands were controlled by the Ottoman Turks, who ran the lands for about 400 years. During this time, there was certainly no Jewish state. And there really was no Arab state either. There was a small Arab state in eastern Arabia. It didn't even include the Muslim holy places of Mecca and Medina. But if you look at all the great Arab nations today, in North Africa, Morocco, Algeria, Libya, Tunisia, Egypt, they were all controlled by European powers. And most of the Arab states, in what today we think of as the Middle East, Mecca, Medina, in Arabia, Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Jordan, the land of Israel, Palestine, all these were controlled by the Ottoman Turks. And so both the Jews and the Arabs wanted a state. It's interesting. The Ottomans were sort of giving up lands. They were called the sick man of Europe. And the Greeks got a state, and the Bulgarians got a state, and the Romanians. These are all states from the old Ottoman Empire. Serbia became an independent country in Eastern Europe. And Jews and Arabs wanted Judea, Arabia. They wanted their countries also not to be under Ottoman rule. And what's fascinating is that the British, who were fighting the Ottoman Turks in World War I, they had joined with the Germans, the Ottomans did, they made promises to the Jews and the Arabs. They promised a Jewish state in Palestine. They promised an Arab state in virtually all the lands outside of Palestine, Iraq and Syria and Arabia, the holy lands of Mecca and Medina. And when I think about this conflict, I always think back about a century ago to 1919, to the agreement between Chaim Weizmann, who would later become president of Israel, and King Faisal, the king at that time of Mecca and Medina in Arabia, and how they made an agreement amongst themselves that there would be Palestine, a Jewish state, and that there would be an Arab state virtually everywhere else. Sadly, the British, like so many colonial mistakes in America, in South Africa, India, and Pakistan, made a mistake here too. They dishonored promises to both the Arabs and the Jews. The king who had helped the British fight against the Ottoman Turks was overthrown by Ibn Saud, the Arabian king, and he was forced to accept the booby prize of Iraq. He had to be king of Iraq rather than the honored king of Mecca and Medina. His brother Abdullah got even worse. Abdullah got 80% of Palestine, the 80% east of the Jordan River. A new country was created by the British called Transjordan. This was to be an Arab state with Faisal's brother. And Palestine, west of the Jordan River, would, under international law, be the Jewish state. Unfortunately, the British dishonored that promise too. Even though under international law and the League of Mandates, Palestine was supposed to be the Jewish homeland, the British curtailed Jewish immigration between the wars, World War I and World War II. This at a time when Europe was becoming one great gas chamber for the Jews. 6 million Jews perished as Britain closed the doors against international law to Palestine. And in fact, Jewish immigration was so restricted that even though there was Jewish immigration, there was actually a higher Arab population increase in the land than a Jewish increase. So the Jews you have to understand that this was a very much a neglected part of the Ottoman Empire. And before World War I, you have populations of less than 1 million, hardly more than the District of Columbia. And then there was Jewish immigration, there was Arab immigration. Many of us know that finally the Jews were so upset with people in the Holocaust dying, and even after the Holocaust, you had about 10% of European Jews left. They tried to return to their homes in Europe, and the Europeans wouldn't allow them. They very much liked living in the Jewish homes, and they didn't want the Jews to come back. There were further massacres after the Holocaust. So 600,000 Jews were stateless, put in detention camps in British-owned Cyprus with literally nowhere to go. Meanwhile, the British, as I said, the Jews, Ben-Gurion, who would later become Prime Minister of Israel, said he would fight the Nazis as if there was no British, and the British as if there were no Nazis. There was wars between Arabs and Jews. There were massacres, atrocities on both sides. The great Jewish community of Hebron, for example, was destroyed. And then, well, most of us know what happened in 1947. The British threw up their hands and said, United Nations, you deal with it, this new international body. They divided the land again, Western Palestine, into a Jewish state and an Arab state. The Jews were a majority in the Jewish state, the Arabs a majority in the Arab state. The Jews accepted the deal, even though Jerusalem, which had been a majority Jewish city for centuries, would remain under the international control, the Jewish holiest city. Nevertheless, the Jews accepted the deal. The Arabs did not. There were some 5 or 6 or 7, I forget how many Arab nations invaded. There's Syria and Lebanon and Transjordan, trained by the British, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, all sent troops in. And at that time, they urged the Arab residents to leave. They said they should flee, get out of the way of their armies, because they couldn't distinguish between friend and foe. And in the incident that the Palestinian Arabs call the Nakba, the catastrophe, about 80% of the Palestinian Arabs did flee the land that would become Israel. Now, some, no doubt, were afraid of what would happen under a Jewish state. No doubt there were rumors of atrocities. No doubt there were some atrocities. How many fled, how many were expelled is still something that historians argue over. But they left. The Jews from the Holocaust were allowed to settle in. And then 2-3 years later, after Israel was formed in 48, 49, 50, 51, the Arab countries expelled their Jewish populations. Jews who had been in Iraq and Egypt for thousands of years, hundreds of thousands, were forcibly kicked out of their homes. Again, some fled for fear of their lives as well. It's fascinating. If you look at the Jewish lands in Arab countries, in Iraq and Egypt, and add them all together, it's 4 times the current size of the state of Israel, which is about the size of New Jersey. So you had Jewish refugees from Arab countries, you had Arab refugees from Israel. The same thing you may know happened when Greece and Turkey split up, or even when India and Pakistan split up. Tens of millions of Hindus who were left in Pakistan went to India. Tens of millions of Muslims in India went to Pakistan. In this case, though, the Jews from Arab countries who ended up being a majority of the population of Israel, and the Jews from European countries were accepted by the Jews in the state of Israel. They were put in camps for a couple years while they tried to assimilate the hundreds of thousands of people. They became part of the Israeli nation. Indeed, many of them living in the homes left by Arabs who had left. The Arabs were not as kind to their Palestinian Arab brethren. Egypt invaded the Gaza Strip. This was area that was supposed to be a Palestinian state and put the Palestinian refugees there in camps that still exist to this day. Jordan, Transjordan at that time, occupied the West Bank, kicked the Jews out of its part of Jerusalem, and they built refugee camps for their Palestinian refugees. In Egypt, the people of Gaza were never allowed to even become Egyptian citizens. This was the way that the land was from 48 to 67. Yasser Arafat was formed the Palestine Liberation Organization under Nasser's rule, the dictator of Egypt, in 1964, began attacks on Israel. Then there was wars, 56, 67. I'm trying to get up to the present day, and then I'm going to have Yousef on to tell me where, if all, he disagrees with this history. But in 67, there was another attempt by the Arab nations to wipe Israel off the map, just as there was in 56 and 48. Israel fought back, and in 6 days conquered the West Bank and Gaza, and also the Golan Heights from Syria and the Sinai from Egypt. And at that time, Israel offered to give back all the lands, with the possible exception of Jerusalem, in order to create a Palestinian state, in order to give them back to Egypt and Jordan. They just wanted peace at that time. The Arab states refused. Now, Israel did eventually sign a peace treaty with Egypt, gave back all the Sinai, did sign a peace treaty with Jordan. Jordan and Egypt say they don't want the West Bank and Gaza. And then in 1993, Israel even signed an agreement with the Palestinian Liberation Organization that had been exiled in Tunis. And they were invited back in with their arms, back into the West Bank, and because they were the first Palestinian group to accept Israel's right to exist, to accept that there would be two states in the area, a Jewish state and an Arab state. They came back in, and we come close to the present day. We have a split between the Palestinians. Many know what happened. There were elections in 2006. Hamas won a plurality of those elections. They won about 43% of the vote. Fatah, the old Palestinian Liberation Organization, won about 40% of the vote. And then Hamas got about 54% of the seats in the Palestinian parliament. But rather than simply accept that they were the majority, they went ahead and arrested and killed and tortured people in Fatah when they took over in Gaza a year later. Since then, many know of the conflict between Israel and Gaza. And we're going to talk about the present. I do want to give Yousef a chance when I come back to go over this history. I want to see if we can agree on some of the facts before we go into the future. In essence, though, you have two peoples fighting over the same land. And it seems that the majority of Israelis and the majority of Palestinian Arabs, I think it's fair to say, want a two-state solution. They may disagree on where the boundaries should be. And yet peace is elusive. You have rejectionists on both sides. You have certainly some Israelis who want all of Western Palestine, as it were, basically the agreement that Weizmann and Faisal made. You have the Hamas that wants the destruction of the state of Israel. They say in their charter they want to kill all the Jews, wanting to fulfill the goal of an Arab state, Palestine, to take its place among the other 23 Arab states. There would be no Jewish state. There would be no Jewish homeland. How do we resolve these issues? How do we resolve, first of all, to see if we agree on the same history, and then how do we go into the future? What is to be done with Hamas? How do you deal with an organization that refuses to even allow any area of the land to belong to Israel? And what of the Israeli population in the elections? Moving to the right, it seems that they were disappointed by the world's reaction to Gaza. We're going to try to address the history and the present with my guest when I come back. If you have a question or comment, give us a call, 888-488-MARK, 888-488-6275. We'll be right back after this.
I helped turn my child's public school into a whole new kind of school. One with a curriculum that really motivates kids. One that has extended hours, 6 days a week, year-round. With loads of academic, cultural, and recreational activities. One that has support services like medical and dental right there. A school where parents' involvement is encouraged. Where teachers have more time to teach. And students are excited about learning. There's just one problem. My child doesn't ever want to come home. You can help turn your school into a community school for excellence. Find out how. Call 1-877-LOVE-TO-LEARN.
It's coming. Right to your neighborhood. And when it does, you may be surprised. It's your Social Security statement of your benefits, and it's going to help you plan your financial future. Your benefit statement will tell you how much Social Security you're eligible to receive and when you'll get it. Then you'll know how much you need to save for retirement, because that's coming too. The future is in your hands. Choose to save.
The toxic fumes from this meth lab are seeping into Jamie's sinus cavity. Ammonia vapors invade her throat. Toxic gases fill her lungs. Jamie's body is deteriorating. And she doesn't even know it.
Jamie, dinner.
So, who has the drug problem now? Find out how meth affects you at drugfree.org/meth.
Here again, the Inside Scoop with Mark Levine.
Welcome back to the Inside Scoop. One of the things that I think very much is a face on the present conflict between Israel and the Palestinians is the past. William Faulkner once said, the past isn't even past. In other words, it still inhabits our perceptions today. I've given my description of what happened in the past. I want to give my guest, Yousef Munayyer of the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee, a chance to quibble with any or all aspects of what I had to say. Go for it.
Well, thanks. First, I couldn't agree with you more in regard to the Faulkner quote. Lenin also had an interesting quote where he said, a lie told often enough becomes truth.
That's true.
And unfortunately, many of the things that you introduced in the first part of the program are sort of repeated misconceptions. They become misconceptions, and there are multiple inaccuracies. Let me see, where should I begin? Just one thing I wanted to point out right off the top. Arabs, you mentioned, like Jews, are named for the place that they come from. They're actually named for the language Arabic. And Arabia took the name on because of Arabic. So that's not exactly true. And I wouldn't create the misconception also that Judea comprised all of the land of Canaan. It actually comprised just the smaller lower half of what is today the West Bank.
That is true.
And so we agree on that. And I wouldn't further the misconception that somehow Jews are religiously tied to the land in any way more than Christians or Muslims. As you know, Christians and Muslims also draw their lineage back to the forefather of the three Abrahamic faiths, in Abraham, who, as the Torah tells us, came to the land of Canaan from what is today present-day Iraq.
True.
So all three faiths are really tied to the same religious roots in the land. Interestingly, in your version of the history, you went on to go from the sort of biblical period quickly up to the Ottoman period, from 1517 to 1917.
It's hard to do 1,000 years in 10 minutes.
It absolutely is, but one of the parts that you conveniently neglected was the rise of the Arabs and the Muslims throughout that area, the development of Arab and Islamic civilization, and the fact that the vast majority of the inhabitants of the land throughout that period were Arabs. And so I think that's important to point out, lest we create the misconception that there was a predominantly Jewish population from the biblical era up until...
well, and there were many peoples there other than Arabs. There were Christians, there were Turks, there were Greeks, Circassians.
No doubt, and we can say for sure that there was a consistent but small Jewish population throughout the period, largely in the areas of Jerusalem and Safa to the north.
Exactly, and a couple other places, Tiberias and Hebron.
Right, and as we get to the Ottoman period, as you suggested, many places within the Ottoman Empire were realizing their national liberation, their national rights, but that is something that the Palestinians did not get a chance to enjoy.
Well, now you say the Palestinians. I mean, at the time they were known as Arabs.
That's not precisely correct. Actually, I'll go on to correcting that later on, but let me just continue on with where we were in the fall of the Ottoman Empire at the start of the World War. As the sick man of Europe began to die and we began to see more and more European influence in the area, the Europeans actually conspired with the Arabs to overthrow the Ottomans during the First World War.
That's exactly right.
And there was an agreement
in 19... And the Jews too, actually.
And the Jews too. And there was an agreement in 1917 called the Balfour Declaration, which announced the British government's intent to create a national home for Jews in Palestine. The second half of that agreement also stated that nothing shall be done to infringe upon the rights of the native population.
That's true, and that's in the Faisal-Weizmann agreement as well.
Correct. The problem is that prior to the Balfour Declaration, 2 years earlier, the British also made a promise to the Arabs, offering them the entire part of the Arab land called the Hussein-McMahon Agreement in 1915. So if we are going to talk about promises and who got promised what when, I think that's important to point out. Another misconception that needs to be corrected is this idea that the sort of the territorial concept of Palestine was one that included the land west of east of the Jordan, and only really came to be the land between the river and the sea after sort of the 20th century, maybe even into the mid-20th century. Historians have actually proved that incorrect, and through a lot of research done into the writings of Islamic clerics who had been corresponding with clerics for the sort of the work in jurisprudence and Islamic legal scholarship, have been able to prove that the territorial concept of Palestine is one that has existed for hundreds of years prior to the 19th century. And I can actually direct you to a great...
Well, it's had many, many boundaries. I mean, you can name it. It's hard to name because it wasn't a country. The only country named Palestine that's ever existed was the British mandatory state.
Right.
So you know where the definitions are.
Specifically in terms of a territorial concept. In other words, an idea tied to an area of land.
Right. Of course, the Jewish lands were east and west of the Jordan River in the ancient Jewish kingdom.
And you can argue that that reached into Iraq and any place else
not that far.
Where the Jews had some sort of lineage, even to the rivers of Babylon. But
they were, if they didn't control the state, then they were exiled there. That's
and again, lots of people controlled the area. But as we continue, I think it's really important to focus on 1947, 1948, and 1949, where there was a whole host of misinformation. And let's start with the sort of the UN partition plan of 1947, which you had mentioned that the Arabs rejected. And the reason that the Arabs rejected that is because just as today we might see in some districts and states throughout the United States, people with political power are able to draw lines around the districts where they can sort of monopolize power through a number of constituents that are within their political party or so on. And the 1947 UN partition plan was very similar. They gerrymandered throughout the entire country, trying to create an area where they would actually have a majority of Jews. But Jews actually were not a majority throughout the entire land.
Certainly, that's true.
But within the sort of gerrymandered territory that they created, Jews did comprise a majority. The problem was they only owned about 7 to 9% of the land within that territory.
Yeah, the British had the great majority of it.
Actually, the private ownership was the largest. The private ownership, like the lands that belonged to individuals.
You're talking about of the privately owned land. The British had about 70% of the entire land of Palestine.
There is different classifications of land. But of the land that belonged to people,
private ownership,
the vast majority of it was not owned by Jews. It was actually owned by Palestinian Arabs. And so,
but to be clear, that's like 30% of the land. I mean, the great majority, it was owned by the state. It was relatively empty land, desert or hills and things like that.
Right, and the problem is Palestine is not a British land. And so the ownership, while we can say is under control of the British state, it is a land for its people, the majority of whom at that time were Palestinians. And there was
legally it belonged
Jewish
to the British.
population.
Before then it was the Ottomans. Before then it was the Crusaders. Before then it was the Arabs, etc.
And we can argue about land ownership. A lot of this stuff is very well documented by historians. And I think that's important to kind of look at. Another important point which really needs to be corrected is your sort of rendition of the 1948 war, there was systematic ethnic cleansing carried out in 1948. And we can argue about whether or not certain people fled or certain people were kicked out. I can tell you, as the grandchild of someone who was kicked out at gunpoint and had their entire town and neighboring towns kicked out at gunpoint, that was not true, that everybody fled. No, that's actually not correct.
Never, and I didn't say that everyone fled. And you would agree there were atrocities on both sides.
And there were certainly people being killed on both sides. However, the process of depopulation was systematic. And Israeli historians, who are now able to use documents in Israeli archives that have become available many, many years after the fact, have been able to prove, actually empirically and rather rigorously, that there was a systematic attempt to depopulate the area. Let's set aside for a moment that the refugees that were created in 1948 were either fled out of fear or were forcefully removed.
I think there was both, no question.
And whether or not they were exclusively one way or the other, the fact that after the war, the party that controlled the side of the border where they were from was the Israeli side, the Israeli government, the newly formed Israeli government. The fact that they did not permit refugees to come back is in itself ethnic cleansing.
Well, no, but that's interesting
let me
because
just point out
every
this
other
one.
place in history has felt the same way. The Arabs didn't allow the Jews to come back. India and Pakistan didn't allow Hindus and Muslims to come back. Turkey and Greece. I think of the Volksdeutsch of Germany that were forced out of Poland after World War II and not allowed to come back.
And all of those tragedies are equally wrong and equally deserve to be heard and equally deserve to be corrected.
They're not still tragedies today. And that, I think, is very interesting.
And part of that is because they've been dealt with through an international and just process. The right of return for Palestinian refugees is not a national right. It's actually a human right. And it's enshrined in the UN Declaration of Human Rights, which Israel had to ratify to be a member of the United Nations.
Do you think Jews have the same right to return to Arab lands?
Absolutely.
Do you think the Germans have the right to go back to Poland?
And
that India and Pakistan, Hindus and Muslims that have the right to go back?
I think a human right is a human right. And it's not one that has
even
ethnic
if it means
or religious
that Israel as a Jewish state will cease to exist. There will be no Jewish state on earth. That would trump any Jewish state's existence.
There is no reason to believe at this point that the right of return that could be exercised as a right would mean the end of a national home for Jews in the state of Israel.
Well,
in fact, when the British wrote the Balfour Declaration and wrote that they envisioned a national home for Jews in Palestine, they weren't doing that with the vision that the Jews would be a majority. In fact, they knew that the Jews would be a minority. Having a national home in a country does not necessarily mean oppressing another ethnicity as the minority.
Our second Clear Outer is up. We've got plenty to discuss in the next half hour. We'll continue this discussion and also take some of your calls at 888-488-MARK. We'll be right back after this.
She's had more than a dozen fractures. And in the next few years, she faces 2 major surgeries to strengthen her fragile bones. She's only 10 years old. Most people don't worry about fragile bones until late in life. For those with osteogenesis imperfecta, brittle bones are a concern throughout their lifetime. Find out how you can strengthen this child's future.
Diabetes is a killer. After I was diagnosed, I didn't feel sick, so I didn't listen to my doctor. Then it struck. I had a heart attack, then a stroke, and I was only 49.
Most people with diabetes also have high blood pressure and cholesterol, which can cause severe heart damage. In fact, 2 out of 3 people with diabetes die from heart disease or stroke.
Don't let diabetes destroy your life.
Call for your free diabetes survival guide. Choose to live.
Here again, the Inside Scoop with Mark Levine.
Welcome back to the Inside Scoop. We're discussing the history and the present of the Arab-Israeli conflict. My guest is Yousef Munayyer of the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee. I really appreciate, Yousef, that even though there's some very strong feelings here, we're able to keep this debate cordial, and I really do appreciate that. Yousef, by the way, was born in Israel. He is an Israeli Arab. He was born in the city of Lod. And in fact, he just showed me his Israeli passport. It's very interesting. The Israeli Arabs, I think, and if we have time, I'd like to get into this, to the difficulties the Israeli Arabs have all the rights of an Israeli, pretty much. We can talk about that. But they certainly have many more rights than the Palestinian Arabs do, and how that's maybe a difficult question. But let's move on. Just to finish our discussion from before, on the Palestinian right of return, does that not, again, I gave all these historical examples. It seems to me that one of the reasons why there's less war in Europe today and more war in places like Africa and the Middle East is because the European lines aren't straight. They're designed. The French live pretty much in France, the Germans in Germany. They fought very hard over these borders, and they're there, whereas the colonial powers drew some sometimes crazy lines in the Middle East and Africa, where tribes and so forth overlap. And it seems to me that you look at a history like India and Pakistan, where the Brits controlled all of that land, and they split up. There's still a lot of enmity between them today, but there is still a substantial Muslim minority in India, whether they're treated fairly or not. They have some rights. There's Hindus in Pakistan, but tens of millions of people did swap sides, and there are no refugees left. And I guess my question for you is, Israel accepted the Jewish refugees from Arab countries. Why didn't Egypt and Jordan accept the Palestinian Arab refugees and make them citizens?
Right, and that's an important question to ask. And that's really because, unlike the India-Pakistan issue, Indians and Pakistanis both realized their national rights on one side of the border. Palestinians were never able to realize their national rights because the refugees that were removed never had a state.
Right, they didn't become citizens of Egypt
they didn't become, no.
Well, Jordan, I think, did accept them.
And in fact, Palestinians wanted to maintain the integrity of their refugee status and not adopt the citizenship of another country because they still wanted to return to the homes and villages which they were from. And their grandfathers and great-grandfathers are buried in. And again, it is a human right. And just...
Well, you say it's a human right. Where has it ever been allowed in his world history? Where, I mean, I even look at the United States of America, where we did horrific things to Native Americans,
Mark,
and they don't control the country anymore.
You've got a legal background. You know, just because a crime's been committed in the past, you can't argue that it should be committed again.
No, what I'm saying
or should be allowed in the future.
Throughout human history, peoples have divided up, and the lines are not perfectly drawn. And people who find themselves on the wrong side of the lines either switch if they want to be in the majority, or they live in a minority in a country that's not of their heritage.
The problems that we see in ethnic conflicts today are largely because ethnic communities, like Palestinians, like Kurds, like Kashmiris, like people throughout the world who don't have states, they don't have a place to call home.
But see, I think there's a difference between Kurds and Palestinians. I support, by the way, a separate Kurdish state, because I think the Kurds have a separate identity. They have a separate religion from the Sunni Arabs that live around them. They have a separate culture. I guess I don't see a real separation between, say, the people of Jordan, the eastern part of Palestine, and the people of the western part of Palestine. I understand it's not the same villages. I get that. But the Arabic is the same, the religion is the same, the culture is very similar.
Right. Well, that's actually completely inaccurate. The people who live in Jordan are of even though they all speak Arabic, and the people in Palestine and Morocco and Saudi Arabia speak Arabic.
But they speak different dialects.
They speak completely different dialects. If you ask a Palestinian and a Jordanian whether or not they're alike, you will see pretty different people.
And today I think that's right, but I don't think it was true when Jordan had the West Bank.
It was absolutely true. You got to remember that Palestinians have a different culture, a different history. They have a history that's steeped in a coastal culture and a village culture, something that is completely different to a far more tribal, far more desert-like culture that the Jordanians have. And there are a lot more traditions on each side that differ because of that. To minimize the Palestinian issue by saying they're just like neighboring Arabs is really offense to all ethnicities. Because the truth is that every ethnic people, every linguistic group, every cultural community is independent in its own way.
And you can subdivide any which way. You can argue that Southerners in America are very different from Northerners, and so, I mean, you can keep subdividing. But here's my question. I guess first of all, do you support, as I do, a two-state solution? I am not against a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza. I support it. We can argue over where the boundaries should be. But I am very much against the right of return because, as I argued before the break, the right of return ensures that there will be 24 Arab states and no Jewish states, rather than having one Jewish state and 23 Arab states.
Right. I think sort of hanging on to the necessity of having a ethnocentric Jewish state is one that's kind of sidetracked us from really achieving everybody's civil, political, and national rights. There's no reason that you can't have a national home for Jews and also have the human rights for Palestinians, particularly the right of return.
If the Jews are not a demographic majority, then all you have to do is read things like the Hamas Charter, where they talk about the day of judgment will not come until Muslims fight the Jews. The stones and trees will say, "Oh Muslims, oh Abdallah, there's a Jew behind me, come and kill him." There are plenty of Arabs that want to massacre all the Jews.
But don't
and if they're in control,
but don't make the mistake of spreading the myth that all Arabs are extremists.
No, they're not. Absolutely
and that's not true.
Absolutely not. But enough of them are that the Jews have understood that when they're not a majority population, they get killed.
I think that and I say this as someone who's lived among Israeli Jews. I think that Israeli Jews have a deep sense of fear and almost paranoia of being governed by anyone other than themselves.
I agree.
And for the history that they've dealt with, I don't blame them for that. However, their dispossession cannot justify the dispossession of the Palestinian people. In no way, and it cannot justify preventing the Palestinians from realizing their human rights and the right of return, or any other human rights.
But you know that
let me just say, in many ways, that paranoia, that fear, has entrapped the Jewish people themselves. And
I actually think it's made them stronger, because it's interesting.
Well, it's made them more belligerent. Well, and it's made them more defensive.
But the point is, they exist. I mean, you look at the Jewish minorities in Egypt and Libya and Iraq and Syria that had been there for centuries and millennia. Those communities are no more. The Jews, as you pointed out, were in Babylonia 2,500 years ago. And Iraq, wholesale, hundreds of thousands of Jews kicked them out because the Jews were not safe as a minority in Iraq. If you make the Jews a minority in Palestine, they will be as unsafe as the Jews of Iraq and Egypt and Libya and Syria. Wouldn't they be?
I don't know if that's necessarily true, because I think we are at a much different point today than where we were 50 years ago or 100 years ago in the eras of rising nationalism and fascism and so on. I tend to believe that the human race has progressed and continues to progress. Absolutely.
Well,
I don't think that we're at the point that, and I don't think we'll ever allow ourselves to fall back to the point that we were in the mid-1940s. Look,
I disagree. I think genocide continues. I think we've seen it in Rwanda. We've seen it today, right now, in Sudan, in Darfur. I don't think humanity has crossed some great divide and suddenly everyone's kind to each other. I see many, many people, and I don't think it's the majority, but certainly Hamas and others saying things like Jews get back in the ovens. We've seen anti-Semitic incidents in Venezuela and England, throughout the Arab world. And I don't mean anti-Israeli incidents, I mean anti-Semitic. I mean attacks on Jews, whether or not they have any connection to Israel. And all that Israelis are saying is give us some, I think all that the Zionist movement has ever said, is give us some small place on earth where we can control our own destiny. We can argue about the borders, and there will always be argument about the borders.
I don't think any Arab in the world would deny the Jews the right to have a place to live where they can govern themselves, as long as it's not at the sake of some other people.
But see, it's interesting because, as you know, the great majority of people who live in Gaza and the West Bank are way under 60 years old. Most of them are in their 20s and even younger. There's a lot of children. The people who are actually literally refugees from 1948 are a very, very small percentage of the people. And I mean, the Jewish refugees are not trying to come back to Poland, as I mentioned in the beginning. They tried to come back, and the Polish said, no, we have your homes now. Get out or we'll kill you. They weren't allowed back into their homes in Iraq and in Russia and so forth. They have no other place to be. They've grown up in Israel for the last 60 years. And fully supporting Arab rights, including your family's rights in Israel, as I do, and I'm against all discrimination against Israeli Arabs. At the same time, to place everything on the right of return seems to me to be unrealistic and not helpful to the Palestinian people.
Well, it's certainly not the only issue. But like I said, it's a human right that transcends national and political rights. If we put that aside.
I think it's been outed in the breach. I don't know of a single people that's ever been allowed it in human history.
And again, that doesn't make it right.
Well, it just tells you that's the way the world works.
But that doesn't make it right. And we can go back and forth. I mean,
let's move on to the present day.
You can say that it's never happened before, and I can continue to say, well, it's still an injustice.
Do you think the Native Americans should be in control of the United States of America? I mean, we did vicious genocidal things to them in the 19th century.
We've completely decimated the Native American population.
Right, they have maybe 1 or 2%. Should the 98% of us leave?
The difference between the grandchildren of Palestinian refugees and the descendants of Native Americans whose society has been completely decimated is that Palestinians refuse to go down that road, where they are left living in nothing but Bantustans, completely devoid of any national and political rights.
Should Native Americans retake the United States?
I think we as in Americans, owe the Native Americans a lot of compensation for that.
I strongly agree with you. I strongly agree with you. We owe tremendous compensation, but I wouldn't say that we owe them the country, that those of us who were not native to America should go back to where the countries where our ancestors were from hundreds of years ago. At some point you got to move on.
Right, but you got to also remember that in 1948, and we can go on about this issue forever, but in 1948 there was a different standard for the way human beings were supposed to treat each other after the creation of the United Nations and the rise and fall of fascism. There was the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And we can go back into history to the time when Joshua entered Canaan and
we can talk about Universal Declaration of Human Rights and how many countries have dishonored it since 1948.
But again, that doesn't make it right. And so I think we need to strive for realizing human rights for all people. And we shouldn't exclude anybody because it makes the idea of somebody's ethnocentric state difficult.
And should be clear, the right of return is not codified in international law anywhere. If you look at resolutions 242 and so forth, they talk about a just solution for the refugees.
The right of return is enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is something that has to be adopted by every country that joins the United Nations. And Israel had to adopt it as well and has been in violation of the UN Declaration of Human Rights since its inception. But we could stay on the refugee issue forever.
Let's move on.
The refugee issue today is part of what is called the Saudi Peace Initiative, in that the realization of UN General Assembly Resolution 194, along with UN Resolution 242.
Do you think Jews should get compensation for the lands that were taken from them in Iraq and Egypt and Libya?
Absolutely.
Okay. And if that compensation is greater than the compensation given to the Palestinians, can we make it a wash?
No, we can't make it a wash. And that is a big problem because the Palestinians did not dispossess Jewish people.
I'll tell you this.
Maybe other Arab states did, but Palestinians should not be held responsible.
We only have 40 seconds in this segment, then we'll go on to the next segment. I would firmly support compensating every Arab that left the state that became Israel in 1948, if every Jew that was forced to leave the Arab countries also got compensation. I actually think the numbers would be roughly comparable, maybe even greater for the Jews, I don't know. As long as both sides get compensated, I'm all for monetary compensation. So I don't know if we have some agreement there.
I think it's a step in the right direction.
All right, we're going to take another break, and if you want to call in, feel free to do so. It's your last chance to do so. 888-488-MARK, 888-488-6275. Let's try to...
I need a job.
Necesito trabajo.
I would like to speak English better.
Me gustaría hablar inglés mejor.
I want to be a U.S. citizen.
Quisiera ser ciudadano de los Estados Unidos.
For over 35 years,
Por más de 35 años,
the Hispanic Committee of Virginia has been serving our community.
el Comité Hispano de Virginia ha estado sirviendo a nuestra comunidad.
Job training and placement,
Capacitación, ayuda para conseguir trabajo,
education for children and adults,
educación para niños y adultos,
immigration, naturalization, and medical referrals.
ayuda para los procesos de inmigración y naturalización y orientación sobre médicos
Are a small part of what we do.
son solo una pequeña parte de lo que hacemos.
For help, information, or to volunteer,
Para ayuda, información o para ofrecerse como voluntario,
contact the Hispanic Committee of Virginia,
comuníquese con el Comité Hispano de Virginia,
helping everyone participate more fully in American society.
ayudando a todos a participar plenamente en la sociedad norteamericana.
Hey, Lena, where's yours?
Would you notice if you were missing half your kidney function? According to the National Kidney Foundation, 20 million people have chronic kidney disease, and 20 million more may be at risk and not even know it. Anyone with high blood pressure, diabetes, or family history of chronic kidney disease is at risk. Early diagnosis is vitally important. To get the whole story, talk to your doctor and visit the National Kidney Foundation at kidney.org or call for a free brochure. Because when it comes to chronic kidney disease, you might not know the half.
Here again, the Inside Scoop with Mark Levine.
Welcome back to the Inside Scoop. My guest is Yousef Munayyer of the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee. We've spent 45 minutes on the past, which is easy to do when you discuss the Middle East. I'd like to try to discuss the present. There's just been quite a conflict in Gaza. We'll talk about that. There's also been Israeli elections and the possibility, though still not yet, of a truce, possibly involving releasing a kidnapped Israeli soldier, possibly releasing some Palestinians. Let me ask you about, I guess, the end, and then we'll move back. Do you support a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza and a Jewish state in the remainder of, I mean, maybe we disagree on the boundaries, but in general, the two-state solution?
I think the general framework, yes. I think there are some problems with the way that it's kind of been described in the public debate. I think in the Arab Peace Initiative, which offers Israel everything that it's been looking for 60 years now, in that it would have total peace and full relations with all of its Arab and Muslim neighbors, there's great hope.
But it requires the right of return.
It requires the realization of...
Which means the end of the Jewish state. See, that's the part that I don't think Israel can ever give in on.
All the Arab Peace Initiative asks Israel to do is comply with international law. If Israel seeks to continue to exist as a pariah and in complete rejection of international law, then not only will it not have peace with the Arab states, but it will also have difficulty throughout the world.
So you know what I find interesting? If the 6 million Jews hadn't been killed in the Holocaust, if they'd been allowed in as the British were required to allow them in under international law in the 30s, there wouldn't be a problem. They'd have the majority. It's basically saying that because we killed so many, there's so few left that now we want to take the last refuge.
And that, the horror of the Holocaust, which is beyond any words or description that we could possibly put together in the next 10 minutes, is something that not only defined the future of the Jewish people, but defined the future of all of humanity. And the the most famous critic of fascism, totalitarianism, and the Nazi regime, Hannah Arendt, looking at the Palestinian situation, said that it is a shame that the realization and the end of one stateless people's struggle created another.
But let me ask you this. Your family obviously is in Israel. They live in a minority, but they do have, I was just asking you about their votes in the recent Israeli elections. They have the right to vote. Do you think that most Palestinian Arabs living outside of Israel wouldn't take some compensation? I mean, again, I don't know that the millions of Germans that were forced out of East Germany, what's today Poland, really want to go back to their lands and be under Polish rule. I don't think that most Hindus and Muslims who switch sides in India and Pakistan really want to go back. I mean, I'm looking for a way to resolve this.
Right,
and a way that you and I can agree, in a way that the majority of Israelis and Arabs can agree.
Absolutely.
Wouldn't compensation be one way to resolve this issue?
Well, I think the only fair way to do that is to ask the refugees. And nobody's ever done that. And nobody's actually went to the refugees and said, listen, you have a choice. You can go back or you can be compensated. What would you like to do? Nobody's done that. In fact, the refugees have suffered the most out of all the Palestinians and have been suffering for 60 years, and there is no voice for them. Today in the Palestinian Authority represents the West Bank and Gaza. They do not represent the refugees, and there is no voice.
You're talking about those outside of the West Bank and Gaza?
I'm talking about those outside of the West Bank and Gaza, correct. Those living in the present-day West Bank and Gaza.
England or France or wherever else they live, Egypt or Jordan.
Right. People who are registered refugees.
Here's something that interests me. There are Palestinians living in Saudi Arabia today that have been there for 50 years, and the Saudi Arabians won't allow them to become citizens. Why do they discriminate? Why do Arabs discriminate against Palestinian Arabs?
Right. Well, I mean, look, there are national and political laws about citizenship in every country in the world. It's not only...
Saudi Arabia won't allow Jews or Christians to be citizens either, but I'm surprised they don't allow Palestinian Muslims.
You know, it's not easy to immigrate here and just get citizenship quickly either. Every country has their own laws, and some of them are more strict, more complex than others. But getting back to the present-day situation, in regard to the elections, which you mentioned, I don't think we should be fooled by the sort of the election win of the Kadima party. And while they have been described by many as sort of the centrist party, and they did get one more vote than the right-wing Likud party, it's important to remember that the Kadima party was born out of the Likud party.
Right.
And what we have today...
But born out of the Likud party that wanted a two-state solution.
It was born out of the Likud party over a discrepancy on what to do with the Gaza withdrawal in 2005.
That's right. Sharon wanted a unilateral withdrawal, and that began the Kadima party.
And despite the fact that the talk from the Kadima party has been about two states, the walk, or the actions, have been settlement expansion, which goes completely contrary to the two-state solution.
Let me ask you this, and I think you know this is what Israelis say. They say to each other, look, we left Gaza, we evacuated, we were ready to help it build ports, seaports and airports and give aid and so forth, and Gaza was taken over by a terrorist organization that shoots missiles at us and wants to destroy us. Wouldn't we be idiots to leave the West Bank and watch the same thing happen? If Gaza had been peaceful, and I supported the withdrawal from Gaza and I really hoped it would work out, I think you'd find a huge number of Israelis ready to leave large swaths of the West Bank. But they look at the Gaza example and they say, we don't dare leave the territory. Are they wrong?
They're wrong to think that way if they think that that's what happened in 2005. That's actually really oversimplified. What happened with the unilateral withdrawal is, first of all, it was unilateral. It was not done in coordination with the Palestinian Authority when it happened.
They wouldn't agree to do it.
Right, because it set up a security situation that the Palestinian Authority could not handle. And when withdrawing, many critics even within Israel said, this is going to create a hotbed for extremism within Gaza.
Was it wrong to withdraw?
If the withdrawal was done correctly, in that the complete withdrawal happened and the occupation ended.
Gaza?
Of Gaza. Now, though the settlers and the military and security apparatus that was inside Gaza was removed, the occupation never ended. In fact, Israel still controlled the sea entries. It still controlled
at the beginning, all the
airspace.
Were open.
It still controlled who went in and who went out of Gaza. The border regime was not something in the hand of Gazans. It was something that was in the hand of the occupying power, which was the Israelis.
Israel controlled its borders. It controlled who went into Israel.
But the legal
Egypt
status,
allowed them to move back and forth to Egypt, not.
But the border between Gaza and Egypt was one that was coordinated and had to be coordinated between Egypt and Israel for security
and the
purposes.
Palestinian Authority.
For security purposes, because Israel remained the occupying power of Gaza.
See, I don't see, when you leave a territory entirely, Israel does protect its own borders and does restrict movement into Israel. But it seems to me that the border in Egypt, that's Egypt's decision. The Palestinian Authority controlled the border. Yes, Israel did not want weapons to come in. There's certainly true that.
Right, but
they did restrict
Israel
goods and
also
services from
controlled the airspace, continued to conduct operations over Gaza, continued to control who went in and out.
But they were building an airport back in 2005. I mean,
no, that was way
Gaza.
before 2005, and it was bombed in the beginning of the Intifada. There was no airport. What you had, even though you had a withdrawal of settlements and soldiers, was an occupation from the outside. Basically, we had the world's largest prison.
Don't you think if Gaza had reacted peacefully, that if there had not been attacks from Gaza, missiles raining into Israel, if the Palestinians had started, as Shimon Peres, President of Israel, likes to talk about Singapore, with their small area, creating with all the help and all the aid of the world, and the UN gives billions of dollars, and Europe, Israel was giving money as well. If they'd begun there, that the great majority of Israelis would say, wow, Gaza's worked out really well. Let's leave huge swaths of the West Bank piece by piece until basically you arrive at the two-state solution.
Right. The problem with that sort of idea is that we can say, oh, if such and such went one way, well, if there was no occupation to begin with, we wouldn't have this problem altogether.
By the Egyptians in 49?
By the Israelis in 67.
Do you think the Egyptians should have allowed a Palestinian state in 49?
I don't think it was their right to declare a Palestinian state. It's the Palestinians' right to declare a Palestinian state.
No, but when Egypt took over Gaza and Jordan took over the West Bank back in 48, should they not have done that? Should there have been a Palestinian state? Were the Arabs wrong to reject the 47 Accord that split the territory as badly as it did?
I think if you were to go back then, look, Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister of Israel, said in 1948, I wouldn't agree, he said, I wouldn't agree, and I'm paraphrasing, but you can look this up. I wouldn't agree to any agreement with the Jews if I was an Arab, because we've basically come in here and taken their land. And I think if you put yourself in the shoes of a Palestinian Arab at that time who's been forced into disenfranchisement, you'd reject 1947 agreement over and over and over again.
And so I'm sure with the Hindus of Pakistan and the Muslims of India and anywhere else there's been a division of territory.
If the immediate aftermath was the realization of their state, then I think it would be different. But Palestinians didn't get a state immediately after 1947.
Right. And I, for one, think that the Jordanians and the Egyptians should have allowed them to have a state, but they didn't. And
well, I, for one, don't think that any other country should control the destiny of a national group. I think they should control their destiny.
And of course, we have people all over the globe who are trying to do their national destiny. You can talk about the Basques in France and Spain. In my view, when a people truly is a separate people with a separate culture, separate religion, separate language, they should have national self-determination. It's very interesting if you go back in the 60s and you look in this pan-Arab movement where they said we're all one people, and then now the Palestinians. I think they are a separate people today. I do support a two-state solution, and I'm hopeful that we can reach some kind of an agreement, you and me and everyone else in this conflict.
I think it's possible. As long as we keep human rights at the center of everything that we do, then there's no reason we can't have an agreement.
Well, I think that's right. At the end of the day, we can argue over some distinctions in history, but I think the majority of Jews and the majority of Palestinians do support two states, one for each. The question is, how do we get from here to there and get rid of the extremists on both sides? Thank you, Yousef, for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Appreciate it.